The World Tonight.
This is Claire Balderson with a special edition of The World Tonight. America is tonight reeling from a devastating series of terrorist attacks which has caused catastrophic destruction and loss of life. 2 hijacked passenger aircraft were deliberately crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York within minutes of each other, destroying both buildings. A third airliner crashed into the Pentagon headquarters in Washington, causing huge damage. Another plane went down in a field in Pennsylvania. A car bomb was also reported to have exploded outside the State Department in Washington. The United States is tonight in shock, the government in Washington paralysed by these unprecedented attacks. It's not known who was behind them, nor is it clear how many people have died or have been injured. The unbelievable chain of events began just before 2 o'clock this afternoon, 9 in the morning New York time, when an American Airlines plane hijacked en route from Boston to Los Angeles plunged into the upper stories of one of the World Trade Center's Twin Towers.
Let's just get back. Get back.
What many thought for a few moments might have been a terrible accident soon began to look much more sinister. As smoke billowed from the 110-storey building and people fled out into the rubble-filled streets, another plane, also an American Airlines jet, crashed into the second tower.
Big explosion happened. Some guy came out. His skin was all off. I helped him out. This is him all over. There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
There was pandemonium. People ran from the towers and from other buildings nearby.
While we were standing out here, we saw, was looking up at the fire, and we saw people just coming through the window, falling out. It was terrible. It was terrible. A tragic day today. We saw it was like a ticket. I thought it was a parade. I saw all the papers coming and I glanced out at the window and then I saw the flames, and then I called my wife up and she told me there was a plane. I thought it was a bomb at first, and then she told me it was a plane. And about, say, 10 minutes later, a construction worker on the site, he saw a plane coming in on the other side of the building, and that hit the building also. That's when we started to evacuate the building.
The planes ripped gaping holes in the 2 buildings. Smoke spread over the whole of Lower Manhattan and panic spread through the area, the financial heart of New York City. Within minutes, though, there was news of another attack. The trail of destruction had spread to Washington, D.C. Another plane had been flown into the side of the Pentagon building, the headquarters of the Defense Department and American military. National Public Radio's reporter John McChesney described the scene.
Our firefighters have knocked a lot of the fire down, although flames are still pouring from some of the windows. And there are a bunch of volunteer teams here who are organized around litter bearing, and we're about to be drafted to go in and pick up injured, which there must be many given the size of the devastation here. There is about a 75-foot hole in the wall here where the wall has collapsed. And the fire looks to be pretty well knocked down at this point, although there's still a lot of smoke pouring from the building. We've been asked to pull back twice because of reports of incoming aircraft, which fortunately never materialized.
And while fires raged and the emergency services sprang into action there, all government buildings, including the White House, were evacuated. Normal life came to an abrupt halt. In New York, meanwhile, the full scale of the horror was only just starting to emerge. First one, then the other of the 2 damaged World Trade Center towers collapsed completely. By 10:30 East Coast time, the twin buildings, 2 of the most famous landmarks of the city's skyline, lay in clouds of dust, rubble and flames. An unknown number of the thousands of office staff who work in them buried underneath. As the authorities urged New Yorkers to evacuate the area, the mayor, Rudolph Giuliani, went to see the devastation for himself.
I thought that I would never live to see anything like this. I didn't think anything like this was possible. When I first arrived there, I rushed down there from Midtown Manhattan, and I saw the first building that had been crashed open. And when you look at it, it takes you a minute to really comprehend that this is actually happening. And to see people jumping from the top of the World Trade Center. I mean, I don't think I've ever had a nightmare that's worse than this.
And there was more. A fourth plane, a United Airlines flight, crashed in Pennsylvania. It too was believed to have been hijacked. As the news sank in, every airport in the United States was shut down and American airspace closed. For a short while, the borders with Canada and with Mexico were shut. The nation was paralysed and in shock. President Bush was at an event in Florida when he heard what had happened. He spoke briefly before hurrying home to Washington.
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence. May God bless the victims, their families, and America.
Condemnation came thick and fast from all over the world. The Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat said the attacks were terrible and shocking. The Secretary-General of the UN, Kofi Annan, said terrorism must be fought resolutely wherever it appears. Here, Tony Blair cancelled his speech to the TUC conference and returned immediately to Downing Street to condemn the perpetrators of the appalling violence.
As for those that carried out these attacks, there are no adequate words of condemnation. Their barbarism will stand as their shame for all eternity. As I said earlier, this mass terrorism is the new evil in our world. The people who perpetrate it have no regard whatever for the sanctity or value of human life. And we, the democracies of the world, must come together to defeat it and eradicate it. This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy, and we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
Tony Blair speaking earlier this evening. Well, in the last hour or so, the mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani, has held a news conference. Thousands of people worked in the World Trade Center and the surrounding buildings. The mayor said the numbers killed may not be known for days, but would, he said, be more than any of us can bear, or affected everybody. What's the international significance?
Well, I suppose incrementally there has been building up. If you take not just the way terrorism has been ramping up a bit, but not to this stage, but also the kind of scenes we've seen in the streets, the whole idea that governments are under challenge. I think we're going to see, if you like, governments getting together and saying this has got to stop. We have got to draw the world back into being a kind of civilized society. We know that democratic societies are always open to attack. They always depend on the consent of those who they govern. They have to be open, they have to be available, they have to be accessible, and that makes them open to attack, whether it's rioters in the streets or jetliners being hijacked. What I think we're now going to see is a good hard think about just how far all of these things can be restricted, how much governments are going to have to come down hard in order to make sure that the bulk of society can carry on, and that those who would take advantage of that openness and freedom need to be restricted, and how much we will all pay the price for it.
In the immediate term, though, presumably the aim is to find whoever was responsible for carrying this out. Are there any ideas as yet?
There are ideas, and indeed there is, I suspect, within the administration, something of a court which is already forming, which is pointing the finger at the Saudi fugitive Osama bin Laden, who has been operating out of Afghanistan for some years, who is known to be hostile to the United States, who has applauded similar attacks on U.S. property and personnel around the world over the last 10 years, has never, I don't think, directly admitted any part in it, but has been accused by the United States of being directly involved in the attack on American embassies in Africa, on the USS Cole last year, and being involved also in the last, or at least being connected to the people who were involved in the last attack on the World Trade Center at the beginning of the decade. So he is the person who I think the US is rushing to convict, and that is perhaps a little dangerous.
Brian Hanrahan, stay with us. Let's introduce here Stryker Maguire, the London bureau chief for Newsweek magazine. Stryker, tell us a little bit about what you think the American response to all of this is going to be after the shock.
Well, I think Brian raises some very interesting points. I mean, there will be a huge desire to respond as quickly as possible and with massive force. But two things about that. First of all, will that retaliation, which will undoubtedly come, will it be unilateral or will it be multilateral? Because that raises very interesting questions about the Bush administration. But secondly, Brian raised the whole question of rush to judgment. And I remember when the bomb went off outside the federal building in Oklahoma City, immediately everybody started going out and rounding up as many sort of Arabs and Palestinians as they could living in the Oklahoma City area. It turned out not to be them. Now, I'm not suggesting that in this case this is an act of terrorism by some bizarre American right-wing group. I'm not suggesting that at all, but everybody is going to want an answer so fast that I think there will be a rush to judgment. And the question is whether the rush to judgment is going to be accurate or dangerously inaccurate.
And I think those two things are connected, because if there is a rush to judgment and it's a unilateral act by the United States, I think it may lack legitimacy. Whereas if there is if you like, a more considered approach in which the US goes through almost a judicial process about deciding who is responsible and takes action against them and can bring the rest of the world with it, I think there is an enormous well of sympathy. Tony Blair talked today about standing shoulder to shoulder with America in the fight against terrorism. President Putin talked about the need for a world reaction against this. The Chinese have been sympathetic. The Iranians have been sympathetic. The Syrians have been sympathetic. I mean, there is an enormous willingness to participate in some kind of fair judgment in this, but not if it is the hammer coming down on the first person the United States thinks is responsible. They could throw away that sympathy.
Okay, Brian, as you're saying, there are many questions raised about today's events and about what might happen next. And of course, the dust is literally just settling after those bombings. But of course, people are asking, how could this have been carried out? How could the hijackers have done it? How could they have carried out such an audacious attack? And joining us now is Paul Rogers, Professor of Peace Studies at Bradford University. He's on the line. Paul Rogers, how could such a coordinated and sophisticated attack have happened in one of the most sophisticated countries in the world?
I think all we can say at this stage is whichever group actually mounted this had a level of sophistication which was quite unexpected and must have had operatives working in the United States for quite a long time, months, possibly even more than a year. This doesn't rule out the possibility that it was an international group, possibly some group from the wider Middle East, but it does suggest a level of organization which I think frankly is surprising, and also suggests a capability for suicide action of a group that had been active in the United States for some time. This is one of the unusual features of the terrible events.
Well, as you say, suicide action, because there must have been hijackers on all those planes who deliberately crashed the planes. Who do you think could have been responsible for such a thing? Obviously speculation at this point, but there must be some suspects.
I think the most likely group would be some kind of coalition from the Middle East. I'm not at all sure that it would have been the bin Laden group, although that might have been involved. One wonders whether, in fact, this is some new group that hasn't previously been active, because without a doubt there has been very high levels of surveillance against the known groups, really, for several years, right since the embassy bombings and before. And this is what makes it possible that either there was a terrible failure of intelligence and security, or this was a new group. If the latter is the case, then it is doubly ominous, because it means this problem is much wider than people expected.
But why, Paul Rogers? Why do this now? To achieve what?
Well, essentially, it was a very major strike against what was considered to be American power, both financial and military. One has to appreciate that there are deep levels of bitterness against the United States in many parts of the world, ones which is very difficult for us to comprehend in the West. And that is particularly true in many movements in and around the Persian Gulf, who perceive that the United States is basically trying to run that part of the world. We may totally disagree with that, but that is where this kind of movement is arising and developing.
And what then do you expect the United States to do next?
I think I would agree with your previous commentators. There could be very strong military action. It could be terribly misplaced if there is this rush to judgment. In a way, you can understand it. This is the worst thing to happen to the United States in generations. But this doesn't mean that you rush to retaliate against people who you may only suspect. But that is the real danger, and that could further radicalize groups and produce further events like this in the future.
Professor Paul Rogers, stay with us, if you will, because we want to talk a little bit more to Stryker Maguire about what American people are thinking at the moment. First of all, I must bring you the latest news that the 47-storey Solomon Brothers building, situated very close to the World Trade Center, has now collapsed. One of the buildings that was affected by the attacks on the World Trade Center, which brought those two buildings down earlier today. Stryker Maguire of Newsweek magazine, the Americans, we're hearing from all of you that they mustn't rush to judgment. There's going to be enormous pressure to do so, is there not, from the public, who must be devastated by this?
Well, I'm sure the public are devastated. At the same time, I can't help sitting here and having been here for about 5 years thinking of how Britons, how Londoners reacted to the Blitz. In other words, a lot of people have asked me, what effect will this have on the American psyche? Obviously, it will have a very, very important effect. But I think at the same time, let's not underestimate the ability of the psyche to sort of heal over time. There will be a huge impulse to do something very quickly and to retaliate very quickly. But the devastation of this doesn't necessarily extend for months or for years. It doesn't mean that suddenly American foreign policy is going to be drastically different. I think it will be importantly different, but not necessarily drastically different.
But Americans have never been through anything like this at all. Is it not going to make them realize that they're not invincible, that they are as vulnerable as anybody else?
Well, yes, I think that is the case. And some people would argue that it will have a similar effect on the Bush administration. The perception among many people, especially in Europe, of the Bush administration is that it feels too insulated, too isolated from world events. And this is a reminder that world events are horribly interconnected.
Stryker, we'll pause there. A reminder to our listeners that this is a special edition of The World Tonight, bringing you the news of the devastating series of terrorist attacks on the United States. It is not possible to talk much to people in the United States because the phone lines are down. It's been very, very difficult to get through. We do have with us here in the studio our diplomatic correspondent, Brian Hanrahan. Brian, of course, everyone in the world now watching this, thinking about this and what's going to happen next. What is happening next? The EU is going to meet. Presumably the phones are going to be ringing in those places where they can get through.
There'll be an enormous amount of consultations. The EU has a meeting tomorrow. NATO has a meeting tomorrow. People are going to start. The two immediate things that will happen. One is that the United States has to restore its government. It has to get itself back together, get President Bush back to Washington, show that it's not frightened of this. The idea that the government is now scattered and that people are talking on the telephone is not going to look good. So very quickly the United States is going to have to restore itself to a working government and show that it's in command of events. Secondly, there's going to be the most enormous intelligence gathering operation. I think that the fingers are going to be coming out from Washington, not just once the frankly, once the CIA and the FBI and the Pentagon get back into their offices, because they're all out in the streets like everybody else at the moment. But once they do, they are going to be reaching out to all the other intelligence agencies around the world, asking the Russians for their help, the Chinese for their help. I think there's some very strange people asked for help. I think we may see a kind of intelligence coalition built rather like the Gulf War coalition, in which people try to find out who did it, and then they'll have to decide what they wish to do next.
And will they get that help? Are we going to see really unprecedented cooperation at an international level?
I think we are. I mean, I think there is a wave of sympathy which is expressing itself around the world, with everybody saying that they cannot tolerate this. This is unacceptable. So I think that we're going to find lots of governments willing to chip in, because the indications are this is not run by a government. I mean, there has been a kind of a rush to dissociate oneself from this. Normally after these kinds of things, there are lots of spurious claims. On this occasion, people are saying with immense firmness, it's nothing to do with us. We'd never tolerate anything like this. These people have got to be tracked down. The sincerity of those offers of help are going to be tested.
Stryker Maguire of Newsweek magazine, you are an American. What are you feeling today?
Well, a lot of different things. I mean, but I do have to say it was brought home to me. I have 6 people that I work with in the office, and you're reminded of how small this world is, because 2 of those people in the office knew 3 people who worked in those 2 buildings that collapsed today. So with television, with the world as globalized as it is, it's amazing how immediate an event like this can seem these days.
And deeply shocking to everybody.
Absolutely.
Stryker Maguire of Newsweek magazine, thank you very much. Thank you very much also to Brian Hanrahan, our diplomatic correspondent. It's coming up to 10 o'clock, and this is Claire Balderson with a special edition of The World Tonight. The United States has been struck by a devastating series of terrorist attacks targeting the country's financial and political centres. 2 hijacked passenger planes were flown into the World Trade Center in New York. Another aircraft hit the Pentagon in Washington. It's not clear how many people have been killed, but the mayor of New York has spoken of a tremendous loss of lives. In the programme tonight, we'll have full details of events which have shaken Americans to the core. We'll be asking who might have been behind the most audacious and destructive terrorist attacks ever carried out anywhere in the world. First, though, we'll have a bulletin of the latest news from Charlotte Green.
A wave of devastating terrorist attacks on key buildings in New York and Washington has caused catastrophic destruction and heavy loss of life. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York were reduced to rubble after 2 passenger aircraft were hijacked and deliberately flown into them within minutes of each other. This woman was inside at the time.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know. And I don't know, everybody just doesn't know where to go. They won't everything is blocked off. You can't even, they're telling us to get out, but there's nowhere to go. And then I heard that another plane hit, and if you go over by there, you can see the people jumping out the window. They're jumping out the window right now.
A third hijacked airliner then crashed into the Pentagon complex in Washington, causing a fire and huge damage. This motorist watched in horror as it slammed into the building.
Huge explosion, and then utter pandemonium, as you might imagine. I mean, everybody was screaming, "Oh my God." People started saying, "We've got to turn around." They hit the Pentagon. A frantic woman turned her car around and started weaving her way out. I got out of my car and went over here, and we could see military personnel bringing tarps out and setting up like a triage unit, a number of stretchers, as they you could hear fire engines, it was just sirens.
Another hijacked plane went down in a field in Pennsylvania. Its intended target apparently the Camp David presidential retreat. It's already known that some 260 people were on board the 4 hijacked airliners, and there are no known survivors. A huge operation is now underway to find survivors. The governor of New York State, George Pataki, has said the casualties will be more than any of us can bear. From New York, Greg Barrow.
All that's left of the World Trade Center is a pile of rubble and fallen masonry. In one blow to the very heart of America, a piece of Manhattan's famous skyline has been wiped out, and beneath it lie the bodies of many civilians, New Yorkers who were making their way to work when disaster struck. All available emergency and rescue services have converged on the southern tip of Manhattan, where the World Trade Center was situated. Their grim task is to sift through the rubble looking for bodies. and it's a job being made ever more perilous by damage to surrounding buildings, which are now unstable and in danger of collapse. There have been calls for blood donors as Manhattan's hospitals try to treat the hundreds of injured. Nobody knows yet how many people died, and it could run into the thousands.
President Bush was in Florida when the attacks occurred. He's now flying back to Washington. At a stop in Louisiana, he described the attacks as a national tragedy.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. We have been in touch with the leaders of Congress and with world leaders to assure them that we will do whatever is necessary to protect America.
Tonight, a senior advisor to President Bush stressed the administration continued to operate effectively. But as our correspondent in Washington, John Sadworth, reports, a sense of shock prevails.
A thick pall of smoke is still visible across the city of Washington as rescue helicopters continue to hover above the Pentagon. Eyewitnesses here describe a devastating impact as the American airliner, en route to Los Angeles with 64 people on board, smashed into the south side of the building around 9:30 local time. As the fire continues to burn, emergency services are struggling with the collapsed building. Casualties suffering from burns, blast injuries and smoke inhalation are being taken to nearby hospitals. Some Pentagon employees in military uniform are congregating on the edge of the security cordon, visibly shocked that such a high-profile symbol of American military power has proven so vulnerable.
All flights within America have been grounded until at least tomorrow afternoon. Transatlantic flights are being diverted. There's no clear indication of which terrorist group or groups were responsible. The leader of a radical Palestinian faction, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, denied an earlier report that his organization carried out the attacks. There's been condemnation from Palestinian leaders, including Yasser Arafat. An Arabic newspaper editor says his paper received a warning 3 weeks ago from the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden that he was planning an attack on American interests. But the Taliban government in Afghanistan, where bin Laden has long been living, denied involvement. Tony Blair said it was hard to contemplate the horror that had engulfed so many people, describing mass terrorism as the new evil of the world, to be fought by the world's democracies. This evening, he announced a series of security precautions, as our political correspondent Norman Smith reports.
Mr. Blair emerged from a meeting of the Cabinet's Emergency Committee at Downing Street to unveil a series of precautionary measures. These included a ban on all flights taking off from the UK, which said Mr. Blair didn't meet the highest standards of security, restrictions on all private flights, and a halt to all planes flying over central London. Mr. Blair said security had also been stepped up at government buildings and military bases. The police were on full alert, and advice had been given to financial and business organisations about appropriate security measures. The Prime Minister said some of these measures would inevitably cause disruption, and he appealed for people to be understanding. Meanwhile, the Foreign Secretary Jack Straw has said that there was no warning or terrorist alert prior to this attack.
For anyone worried about friends or relatives in the United States, the Foreign Office has issued an emergency telephone number: 020-700-800. That's 020-700-800.
Charlotte Green. New York and Washington have today suffered catastrophic destruction and heavy loss of life in a series of attacks by unknown terrorists. Tonight, a huge operation is underway to find survivors from the wreckage of both towers of the World Trade Center in New York. Our correspondent in the city, Greg Barrow, joins us from there now. Greg, take us back a bit over the day's events. What happened this morning?
Well, Claire, this morning, just as everyone, including myself, was going to work, there was the most unexpected and extraordinary event around the World Trade Center. Two passenger planes, one shortly after the other, crashed into each of the twin towers of the World Trade Center, set the building alight on the upper floors, and then within an hour, the whole of the World Trade Center, one of the landmarks of the famous Manhattan skyline, had come crashing to the ground ground, engulfing a huge area beneath the building in a sort of downwards barrage of smoke and masonry and glass and metal covering everything below it. And the rest of the day has been occupied with trying to come to terms with that, not just in the emotional sense, but in the physical sense, getting down there, getting the emergency effort underway, and also trying to get the city back to normal. Throughout the day, the city has become paralyzed. At one point, there was no way of moving around the city. Many of the streets were cordoned off, the subway system wasn't running, the telecommunications system was down. Some of that has begun to get back on stream, but still there is a sense of disbelief about what's happened here over the past few hours.
Describe for us the area where this happened, because it was a large chunk of Manhattan, wasn't it, that was then affected by the smoke, the flames, the panic?
Yes, well, you have to imagine two of the tallest buildings in the world uncontrollably falling down in a very heavily built up and densely populated part of Manhattan, which is a very tightly packed city at the best of times. This is what happened just under an hour after the impact of those planes, and this led to huge billowing clouds of smoke racing down the narrow streets and avenues of Manhattan and covering up everything in their path. And that smoke has hung over the city for most of the day and is continuing to pour out of buildings surrounding the World Trade Center, which are now on fire.
Is there any word yet, Greg, of the number of people who may have been killed and injured in this?
No, there's no word at all, and any tolls at this stage are pure speculation. We heard only from the mayor of New York, Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, who said that 600 people had been taken to Manhattan hospitals. He said of those, 150 were seriously injured, but he refused to speculate on the number of dead. What we do know is that when the World Trade Center is full, it can accommodate up to 50,000 people, and on top of that, you sometimes get thousands of tourists who are riding up the building to take in the sights of New York from the very top of the World Trade Center. Now, if you have a worst case scenario there, then literally thousands and thousands of people could be dead. But what was happening shortly after the impact of those planes was that the emergency services were trying to evacuate people as quickly as possible, and it just depends how many they evacuated before the buildings collapsed. That will be the critical factor in deciding just how many people were killed.
Greg Barrow in New York, many thanks for joining us. Well, of course, the other area that was most seriously affected by events today was Washington, D.C., the political centre of the United States. David Shribman is bureau chief for the Boston Globe there, and he's on the line now. David, tell us what happened in Washington.
Well, what happened in Washington was first the reports of incidents in New York, terrifying, terrible incidents in New York, and then local episodes here, a plane crashing into the Pentagon, and as a result, Washington has cleared out. I'm looking out over the busiest intersection in Washington, the confluence of Connecticut Avenue and K Street, and there are only 3 or 4 cars there, and ordinarily at this time it would be impassable.
Does anybody know yet how many people may have been killed in that attack on the Pentagon?
Nobody knows how many people were killed. We do know about 100 people are in hospital now. We don't know how many people who are in very serious danger and are not in hospital, and we don't know how many people have been killed.
What are people in Washington saying about all this? They must be in a state of terrible shock.
Well, they're in a state of terrible shock in part because the greatest symbol of American military might has been successfully attacked. The attack was not repulsed. That nothing seems safe the way it was only several hours ago. That the sense of security here is non-existent, and the idea of national security, which we used to measure in terms of missiles and bombs, has to be totally redefined.
Where is President Bush at the moment? Is he planning to speak again?
President Bush is planning to address the nation tonight. We don't know what time it will be. He's made 2 short statements since the morning attack. One of them was in Louisiana. He was sent to an air base in Nebraska, an air base that was really at the center of all of our Cold War planning, and where there's a secure place, a bunker for him to be. And now I'm told he's heading back to Washington, and we know that he will be speaking to the country tonight. We don't know what time, and we don't really know what he can say at a moment like this.
So to what degree is the government of the United States still functioning?
It's not functioning right now. Of course, ordinary parts of government have been closed all day long. Monuments and museums and zoos, the processing of passports and that kind of thing. The national security-oriented parts of the government are functioning at a high pitch, and indeed National Guard units, which are the equivalent of your home guard, have been mobilized here in Washington and around the country.
David Shribman of the Boston Globe, thanks for joining us from Washington. Well, in recent years, the United States has been the target of terrorism, both at home and abroad, though, of course, nothing like this ever before. Enver Solomon has been looking back over the past decade at the series of attacks directed against the world's superpower.
It's not the first time that the World Trade Center has been targeted. Just after midday in New York on a snowy February afternoon in 1993, a bomb hidden in a vehicle in the building's underground car park exploded. Hundreds were caught in the fire that engulfed the Twin Towers. Many telephoned local radio and television stations for help.
A number of people have been calling the station, and they've been asking us if they should go up to the top floors of the World Trade Center buildings because they've seen helicopters up there. But we want to tell you this, it's very, very important. Don't go up to the top of the building. Don't go to the roof because the choppers have not been able to land.
6 people were killed and nearly 700 injured. For the first time, the American public experienced a major terrorist attack on its own soil. The then governor of New York, Mario Cuomo, demanded the immediate arrest of the perpetrators.
It is absolutely essential that we discover the person that did it, or persons, and that they be punished, not out of vindictiveness to relieve the anger, but out of deterrence, to let people know you cannot do this with impunity in this place.
4 years later, 2 men, a Jordanian and a Pakistani, were convicted in a New York court for masterminding the attack. After their exhaustive investigations, the FBI said that the Pakistani, Ramzi Ahmed Yusuf, was linked to Osama bin Laden, a mysterious Saudi millionaire based in Afghanistan. Mr. bin Laden was soon to become the #1 target for America's counter-terrorist agencies. But there were other groups in the Middle East preparing to target American forces in the region.
There was no warning whatsoever. Today was just a normal business day. This came literally as a bolt out of the blue. The first we heard about it was a phone call a little after 11:30. The blast occurred a little before 11:30.
The U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Raymond Mabus, was stunned when a car bomb exploded at an American military base in the capital, Riyadh, killing 5 servicemen in November 1995. 7 months later, U.S. soldiers were again targeted, this time in Dhahran in the east of the country. A truck loaded with explosives rammed into a barracks, killing 19 members of the U.S. Air Force. It was only in June this year that the American authorities were finally able to indict 13 Saudi Arabians and 1 Lebanese man for the attack. The indictment said they belonged to an Iranian-linked Islamic organization known as Saudi Hezbollah. But these attacks in Saudi Arabia were soon dwarfed by events at American embassies in East Africa in August 1998.
We're probably a good kilometre away from where the bomb happened, and the whole building shook. Immediately afterwards, huge plumes of black smoke billowed up into the sky, so there's obviously a major fire continuing on there.
Rufus Drabble was in the British High Commission in Nairobi when a car bomb exploded at the American embassy, killing more than 200 people. Shortly afterwards, an explosion left 11 dead at the embassy in the Tanzanian capital, Dar es Salaam. The White House was quick to link the attacks to Osama bin Laden, and President Clinton didn't hesitate in ordering reprisal attacks.
Today, I ordered our armed forces to strike at terrorist-related facilities in Afghanistan and Sudan because of the threat they present to our national security.
An estimated 50 people were killed in the missile attacks on the suspected training camps in Afghanistan, but none of them reached the door of Mr. bin Laden himself or his most senior associates. And the suspected chemical plant that was hit in Sudan was later proved to be a factory producing medicines and drugs. The Americans, however, have contested this. Earlier this year, 4 followers of Mr. bin Laden were sentenced to life imprisonment in an American court for involvement in the embassy bombings. US intelligence said they'd uncovered a worldwide network of Islamic groups that the Saudi millionaire was controlling. Officials believe that further evidence of this came last year when an American warship was attacked in the Yemeni port of Aden, killing 17 sailors. Although there's no clear evidence yet, investigators suspect that the bombing was inspired by Mr. bin Laden. American embassies in the Middle East were put on immediate alert and have remained so ever since. They were expecting the next attack to be on their doorstep, rather than in the heart of America itself.
Enver Solomon reporting, and a reminder that you're listening to The World Tonight with me, Claire Balderson, bringing you the news of the devastating terrorist attacks on key buildings in New York and Washington that have caused catastrophic destruction and heavy loss of life. The twin towers of the World Trade Center in New York were reduced to rubble after 2 passenger aircraft were hijacked and deliberately flown into them within minutes of each other. Well, Chris Yates of Jane's Defence Weekly says there had been some warning signs about the state of security at US airports.
It is frightening that this sort of thing could have happened in somewhere like America, but then perhaps not all that surprising. You know, the United States has had a problem with its aviation security for a number of years now. That fact was highlighted by the Gore Commission in 1996. It found that the entire aviation security system was in an appalling state of disrepair, and it recommended $100 million worth of investment per annum through until 2004, 2005, and to put what's wrong right. And now, amongst the things that are wrong, you can look at things like passenger cabin baggage screening, and in particular the performance of the screeners. Some of these guys are very poorly paid. In fact, McDonald's workers are often paid better than security screeners. They are very poorly trained, and in trials, it has been shown that these people fail to identify explosives concealed in bags, indeed weapons concealed in bags, in some instances up to 20% of the time.
But even if the system is weak, even if there are these lapses, it would require a huge organisation, wouldn't it? An extraordinary organisation to pull off something like this.
Yeah, it requires a degree of organisation, but one has to remember that the information about the lax security measures in the US is out there in the public domain. It's been out there in the public domain since 1996, and indeed some other issues were highlighted prior to that. So, you know, there isn't really the intelligence gathering operation that's required to mount an attack like this. It really just means picking up newspapers, defining what the loopholes are and how to use those loopholes to best advantage, and then take it from there.
Once those planes were in the air, though, how come that was not spotted, that something was amiss? Did radar not react, for example?
You know, it's highly likely that air traffic control did know that something was amiss. Clearly, they must have done. Every aircraft, when it takes off from an airport, has to file a flight plan, and that flight plan is very clearly defined, including air routes and so on. The minute an aircraft deviates from those air routes, then it is standard practice for air traffic control to call the pilot and keep on calling until he gets a response. If a response is not given, then in theory, yes, you would launch military fighters and you would have them intercept those aircraft. That clearly didn't happen in this case. Perhaps there wasn't time in this case.
Chris Yates of Jane's Defence Weekly. So once on the planes and in control, what might the hijackers have done next? Annie Redmile, an aviation expert, told me that the terrorists must have had some knowledge of flying aircraft.
They wouldn't necessarily have to be pilots, but my guess is they would have aviation knowledge. But if the pilots had guns pointing at their heads and they were told to fly somewhere, they would normally respond to that by flying somewhere because they wouldn't want to make an immediate fuss and cause conflict in the flight deck.
Even if they were told to fly into a building like the World Trade Center?
No. That's an entirely different ballgame. If you look at some of the hijackings of back in the late 60s, early 70s, there they were directed from airport to airport. But I don't remember any situation where anyone was told fly into a building. That is a situation where they'd have been overcome, in my view, or somebody else had taken controls.
Do they have, pilots, any training in dealing with this kind of thing?
Yes, they have training, as do cabin crew, but how can you ever imagine what it's like in reality? It's great having academic training in these things, but when the sheer terror, when there are people there with guns saying, we've taken over, you're flying into a building, I don't think anyone can be really trained for that.
But do you think the most likely scenario is that it wasn't that they didn't decide to obey their instructions, that they would have had to have been overpowered?
They would have been overpowered, I'm quite sure.
And therefore the controls must have had to be seized by someone who would have known quite a lot about flying planes, large planes.
Yes.
What does this mean, do you think, for the future of airline safety?
I think it's a crossroads. I think it's such a dramatic example of how security can be just overmanned, overpowered. And I think it brings home the very nature of international terrorism now, and that it's not just the problem of the United States or the UK, it's a global problem. It's a global threat, and there's got to be real coming together of countries to try and overcome this.
And how can it be overcome when it comes to securing airlines?
There will never be total security, and that's what people, I'm afraid, have to accept. But anyone flying has to be very vigilant, and certainly will be in the foreseeable future.
Aviation expert Annie Redmile. So who were they in this situation? Just who could have been responsible for the day's terrible events? Joining me now are Sean Boyne from Jane's Intelligence Review, and Brian Hanrahan, our diplomatic correspondent, is with me here in the studio. Brian, is there any idea yet who might have been behind all of this?
Well, there have been some hints from the United States, so we're hearing from anonymous officials that they think that Osama bin Laden, the Saudi millionaire who has been in Afghanistan, is reputed to have been behind a number of attacks made against the United States, was responsible. Indeed, I'm looking back and I see that bin Laden is alleged by an American grand jury to have opened up a pact with another group of terrorists, an Algerian group, last month, and they say that he met this other group in December 1998, and he's been training their men. He's been indeed training other people with the idea, it looked as though he was training them to carry out operations for themselves, but presumably there would be a two-way process, and that would give him the right to call on other groups to help him, which would account for the if you like, the extraordinary sophistication of this, the number of different strands that we've been hearing about, the skill to pilot aircraft, the willingness to commit suicide, the ability perhaps to pass oneself off as North American in order to evade security checks. These are not things that you would expect one group necessarily have the expertise to do, but if you put a group together, a coalition together, maybe Mr. bin Laden has been able to do that, although as yet it is speculation and hearsay rather than hard evidence.
Indeed, though, Sean Boyne from Jane's Intelligence Review, do you think that is the direction in which the finger should be pointing?
Well, at present he seems like the most obvious suspect, but clearly this is speculation at the moment. We just don't know, and one is mindful of the Oklahoma bombing some years ago when everyone assumed there was a Middle Eastern connection and turned out to be a domestic situation. But for the time being, at least, the circumstantial evidence points to somebody like bin Laden. The use of suicide bombers, the level of organization involved, and the fact that he has in the past been able to apparently organize major terrorist events far from his base in Afghanistan. Why,
though, would he, or indeed anyone else, be doing this at this time? To achieve what?
Well, we had the report from the editor of the Arab language newspaper Al-Quds that 3 weeks ago there was a warning from bin Laden that he was going to attack America in retaliation for its support for Israel. And obviously Israel has been involved in hostilities with the Palestinians. and this is very much a big issue in the Middle East, and this may have been the catalyst, if indeed he was the person involved.
So, Brian, security officials in the United States are surely going to be looking towards the Middle East, are they not, given what has been going on there in the last few months?
Oh, indeed. I mean, it's not as though this has come out of a clear blue sky. We've been hearing for a long time about the level of dissatisfaction amongst many Arab peoples about US policy in the whole area. They do not like its what they see as its siding with Israel in the dispute over the Palestinian areas. They do not like the way it's been treating Iraq. The whole Gulf policy has been sort of slowly unpicked. It's not getting support even from governments. So there's been a degree of hostility to the way the US has behaved in that area, which has been damaging its policy. And there have been repeated warnings that this lack of sympathy is likely to take itself out in attacks on US personnel and US property, although it's not been suggested that would be carried into the United States itself.
In the past, the United States has retaliated for such attacks. It retaliated once before against Osama bin Laden. What do you think is going to happen this time, Brian?
I think they will retaliate. I think they will at the very least fire missiles at wherever they believe him to be once they've gone through a process of satisfying themselves that they think he's responsible. They may even take more active action than that at a time when the Afghan government itself, which is harbouring him and is refusing to give him up, they may say that there'll be very little sympathy if they try to take more active measures to get him out within Afghanistan itself. But it's very hard to tell what they're capable of. But I think whatever the United States thinks it is capable of doing, it will do on this occasion.
Sean Boyne, do you agree with that?
Yes, I think that they will take retaliatory measures as soon as they can as soon as they work out who is the culprit. I think there's a danger that they might act prematurely and thereby lose credibility. Of course, the Americans have suspected for some time that bin Laden was going to attack American targets, especially financial targets in New York. I was just looking back through the Jane's archives, and there was a story in September '99 in Jane's Terrorism and Security Monitor reporting that law enforcement agencies were fearful that bin Laden's group was preparing for a series of new attacks on U.S. targets, especially financial targets in New York. And that's 2 years ago.
Sean Boyne of Jane's Intelligence Review, thank you very much. Thanks also to our diplomatic correspondent, Brian Hanrahan. Well, the reaction to today's events in the Middle East has been mixed. The Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat, said he was horrified by the attacks, called them unbelievable. The Syrian government also condemned the attacks and expressed its sympathy with the American people. But on the streets of the West Bank and Gaza and elsewhere in the region, there have been some scenes of celebration. Earlier today, though, the Palestinian politician Hanan Ashrawi told Robin Lustig that she was shocked by the attacks.
I think it's absolutely tragic and it's unconscionable. It's like a declaration of war, but against innocent civilians, and one doesn't know and cannot even comprehend who would think to do such a horrible act of absolute immorality and viciousness and evil.
Yasser Arafat has already condemned the attacks. Many people, though, will be wondering if there could be a Middle East dimension to this, after all of the violence which there has been in Israel and the Palestinian territories over the past year. Do you believe it is possible that there is a link?
I don't think so at all, because, first of all, as Palestinians, we are people who are under occupation, and resisting occupation, it's going to be impossible to even think of carrying out such an act by Palestinians. But if you're talking about the Middle East in general, one doesn't know, really. It's very, very difficult to project, and I would caution against making such links that are not necessarily true at all, because people have a way of responding in stereotypes and labels and attempting to associate Palestinians with this. And I can certainly say that Palestinians would not do this act, and that certainly they shouldn't be connected to this criminal action.
Hanan Ashrawi talking to Robin Lustig a little earlier today, and joining us now are Roger Hardy, Middle East specialist with BBC World Service, and the Syrian journalist Tahed Salam. Roger Hardy, tell me a little bit about what further reaction there's been in the Middle East.
I think it's perfectly true that in one or two quarters people have been applauding, but I think one should remember that a great many people in the Middle East and a great many people in the wider Muslim world are shocked by this, just as everybody else has been.
Yes.
So, of course, there are big grievances against America in all sorts of corners of the Muslim world, but we shouldn't rush to judgment and say that all Arabs, all Muslims are clapping their hands. I don't believe that.
Well, Tared Salem, what is the situation in Syria? What are people there saying?
Well, actually, it was a kind of a shock. Nobody could believe an operation like this could happen in the very heart of the financial capital of the United States. Although some people take it or took it that if the Palestinians or any pro-Arab party is behind the attack, it is the responsibility of the United States because of its attitude vis-à-vis what's going on in Palestine and its approval of the assassination policy of the Palestinian leaders by Israel. Some people said it's God's will. Nevertheless, although in Arabic they say one shouldn't laugh at people in distress, they believe that the United States has gone too far, although they can't understand or really be convinced that an Arab organization or pro-Arab organization is capable of carrying out an operation like this.
Well, indeed, are they saying who might have been behind it? There must be speculation in the Middle East.
Yes, well, most likely it could be an organization that has a genius mastermind first, then capable of training people as pilots. 3, it has financial capacities, and above all, it has elements who are willing to die for a certain cause. So this is, in general, these are the lines according to which people are guessing, but nobody is sure who this organization could be. There is a talk about Bin Laden maybe, or any other organization. But if it's as I said, it's an Arab organization, this means, according to the educated people, the ordinary man, this means that the Arabs have reached a really very sophisticated level of operating in the world.
Roger Hardy, does this mean also that there are going to be many people in the region fearful of reprisals from the United States? There's going to be a lot of people who are nervous about that, aren't there?
I think it's clear that George Bush will feel he has to do something. He's slightly caught. I mean, if he waits for clear forensic evidence, which might provide a link with Bin Laden, then he may have a long wait. It's very hard to know how long it would take to find the proverbial smoking gun. If, on the other hand, we get a knee-jerk reaction, like the response that Bill Clinton made 3 years ago after the bombing of the 2 American embassies in Africa, then George Bush will be accused of precisely that, of a knee-jerk response when he doesn't really have proof positive.
There has been a growing solidarity in the Arab countries behind the Palestinian cause. If this does turn out, and of course it is speculative at the moment, if it does turn out to have been a Middle Eastern group of some kind, will this cement that solidarity or divide it?
I think there's no question that the mood in the Middle East and the wider Muslim world is a deeply, deeply anti-American mood. If George Bush hadn't realized the depth of that hostility to the United States, and I think he must very painfully be realizing it now, I think a lot will depend on how America and its allies, including Britain, choose to respond to this. The Intifada is one of many factors. The Intifada issue, the Iraqi issue, have all fed into the same river, if you like, the same current of anti-American feeling. That's one of the things that's behind this extraordinary series of terrible attacks.
Tared Salem, do you agree with that?
Yes, I do agree. Of course, this is really this is how one can describe the feelings of the people here. It is time that the United States should at least, if not stand neutral, lift its hand from supporting Israel. Again, for example, today I was in a cafe later this evening when Mr. Blair came on the air. Even the people didn't like his tone. He said he's too much arrogant. Indirectly, he's talking about terrorism, etc., while he's doing this to the Iraqis. He's not doing enough to stop the bloodshed in Palestine.
Tared Salem, we'll leave it there. Syrian journalist Tared Salem, thanks also to Roger Hardy, the BBC's Middle East specialist. Well, there has been swift condemnation from many parts of the world, and European Union leaders have been talking to each other. Our Brussels correspondent Angus Roxburgh has been following a NATO meeting this evening. He joins us on the line from there. Tell us what's been happening at NATO and amongst the European Union.
Yes, well, there's the same sense of shock, of course, in Brussels as everywhere else in the world. Flags are flying at half-mast outside the European Commission here and at NATO headquarters. And tonight, the 19 NATO ambassadors, the ambassadors of the 19 NATO countries, met for about an hour, really to express their solidarity with the United States. Lord Robertson, the General Secretary of NATO, came out afterwards to speak to journalists. He said that he described it as a time of great tragedy and mourning, and spoke about an act of unspeakable violence. He really was running out of superlatives to describe his horror at what had happened. And behind it all, I think, although he didn't express it this way, one can't help feeling that there's a little bit of a sense of helplessness and vulnerability there too, because NATO, after all, is an organisation that relies on armies and navies and missiles for its defence. And here, something has happened which they all understand couldn't have been prevented by armies, navies and missiles, and that leaves them, I think, feeling pretty vulnerable.
Any idea of what they can do practically, what they plan to do?
Well, all they can do at the moment, and all they have done so far, is offer America solidarity and support. Lord Robertson said that there was no doubt that the perpetrators of these acts would have left tracks and that they would be found. As for practical help, I suppose both NATO countries and EU countries can help with the clean-up in New York and with the investigation by providing intelligence and so on to try and track down the perpetrators.
Angus Roxburgh, many thanks for joining us. Well, of course, the greatest shock has been felt in the United States. It is proving very, very difficult to get through to people there. The phone lines have been down for most of the day. It's been extremely difficult to make any phone calls. But with me here in the studio is Tom Reed, who is the bureau chief for the Washington Post newspaper. Tom, there must be an incredible sense of shock amongst all Americans today.
Yeah, genuinely horrible feeling. I'm sure I know somebody who died in those buildings. It's a terrible feeling. And it's a feeling, I feel our country's at war. We're very close to being at war. I'm in the U.S. Navy Reserve. I've been maybe my unit's going to be called up. It feels like, although I wasn't alive on Pearl Harbor Day, nothing like this has happened since Pearl Harbor Day. And I think the sense is going to grow in America that somebody attacked us, may have killed thousands of Americans. And I don't think our country will let them get away with it.
And what do you think your country will do to whoever they are?
If you look at the trial that was just completed we convicted 11 people for the bombings in the 2 embassies in East Africa, we know a lot about the bin Laden organization. It's amazing how much information we came up with about that organization. I've looked at that trial. There's no doubt those people were connected with bin Laden. Anybody who went on this airplane was filmed. They have names. If a person is a trained pilot and got on those airplanes and there's a group of them, it had to be a pretty big organization to coordinate it. I just don't think they can get away without being caught. If it does point to bin Laden, then somebody in Kabul better be rethinking his policy because they can't protect that gentleman anymore.
Just very briefly, Tom, a sense in America today perhaps that the country is not invincible. It may be a superpower, but it is vulnerable.
We never had the sense we were invincible. I don't think anybody in America thought that, but I do think we feel there's an enemy out there, and I'm pretty sure the United States and this new president are going to feel a need to go after him.
Tom Reed of the Washington Post, many thanks for joining us. Well, it has been the most serious terrorist attack ever, and the shock has been felt, as we've been saying throughout this programme, throughout the world. But nowhere more powerfully than on the streets of New York and Washington. Nick Ravenscroft takes a look now at the human tragedy of today.
The start of another trading day in New York's financial district descended into pandemonium.
There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
President George W. Bush was alerted within minutes of the attack.
And have ordered a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
But shortly after the president's address, a third plane crashed into the Pentagon in Washington.
People started saying, we've got to turn around. They hit the Pentagon. A frantic woman turned her car around and started weaving her way out. I got out of my car and went over here, and we could see military personnel bringing tarps out and setting up like a triage unit, a number of stretchers. As they you could hear fire engines, it was just sirens as they arrived.
One side of the building was left in ruins. Along with the White House, the Pentagon had been evacuated shortly before, but details of casualties are still a matter of guesswork. Back in New York, the emergency services simply could not deal with the scale of what was happening. There was a massive rescue effort to save those still trapped in the World Trade Center, but within an hour of the first plane impact, the North Tower collapsed, quickly followed by the South Tower. The enormous scale of the disaster, one senator comparing it to the World War II attack on Pearl Harbor, has sent ripples of disbelief far around the globe. Frank Gaffney of the Center for Security Policy in Washington says America's reaction must be strong.
The United States is at war now, and I hope that the president will respond appropriately and accordingly. This is not a matter for business as usual, a judicial process, forensic investigations, and so on. I believe that we have been struck in a way that is probably going to be a precursor to even worse. And it is time for us to act as I think our friends in Israel have been doing for some time, quite correctly, which is to use such intelligence as we do have, to use such force as we have at our disposal to strike at and try to destroy these terrorists and their sponsors before they strike again.
And that report was compiled by Nick Ravenscroft. A reminder of the main news tonight. A huge rescue operation is going on in the United States after the devastating series of attacks on key buildings in New York and Washington. 2 hijacked passenger aircraft deliberately crashed into the twin towers of the World Trade Center, completely destroying both of them. Tonight, the 47-story Solomon Brothers building next door has also collapsed after catching fire. The Pentagon complex in Washington is still burning after a hijacked airliner also plunged into the building. President Bush has met security officials at an Air Force base in Nebraska to discuss America's response to the attacks. He said the perpetrators would be hunted down and punished. Tony Blair said the terrorists' barbarism would stand as their shame for all eternity. He announced that security was being stepped up at all British airports. And within the past few minutes, the Americans have announced that their airspace will stay closed until Wednesday. And that brings us to the end of The World Tonight. From me, Claire Balderson. Good night.
Studio production for that extended World Tonight was by Charlotte Smith and Tamsin Smith, and the editor was Helen Towner.